There are four elements that are particularly important to humans. We'll talk about other elements and ions throughout this course and how they relate to physiology and anatomy. But the four main elements are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. While there are other elements that will play a role in the type of compounds we're going to look at now, organic compounds, the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen are the main elements involved in building each of these compounds that we're going to take a look at. Okay, so now let's look at some of the other chemicals that are important for life, and let's look at the four main types of organic compounds. Before we get into that though, let's remember something from earlier on in the course, that our bodies take in raw materials. We eat food, we digest that food, we absorb that food, we use the nutrients from it in order to build things that our body needs. The cell also does that. So after delivering those nutrients to our cells actually build the things that they need and get rid of wastes. So there were two main concepts that we spoke about earlier in the course. Those were that our body undergoes this process of catabolism. It actually breaks things down. So I might take in protein, let's say from meat that I eat in my diet, and my body will undergo the digestion process where it breaks that protein down, and it actually breaks it down into amino acids, the building blocks of protein, and then my body brings in those amino acids, and then my cells use those amino acids for anabolism, where I take amino acids and I build protein, and it uses energy in order to build up the protein that I actually need in my cells. So let's look at the four main types of organic compounds that actually undergo these processes. The first is sugar, or carbohydrates. The base unit of a carbohydrate is a monosaccharide. The prefix mono means one, and saccharide represents the sugar. And so glucose is a sugar that you've probably heard of before. It is a 6-carbon ring, as indicated here. Then if we took two of those glucose and combined them together, we actually could form a disaccharide. The prefix di meaning two. And there are various disaccharides, which we'll talk about later in the digestive system, that are different combinations of the different monosaccharides that actually make up the carbohydrates. A polysaccharide then, poly the prefix means many, and so as you can see here there are many glucose bound to each other, and these form different chemicals that you've probably heard of before, like starch that you get from plants. Or how we store our energy in humans is as glycogen, which is a polysaccharide made up of many glucose molecules bound to each other. The second time is proteins, represented by some of the foods here. Proteins, the basic building block is amino acids. All amino acids have the structure that you see here. There is actually a central carbon bound to a hydrogen, bound to an amine group, and bound to an acid group. And this is where the amino acid actually gets its name, because it's made up partly of an amine group and an acid group, so amino acid. And then beneath the central carbon you can see a blue box. That blue box represents an R group. R is not an element on the periodic table, but what it's representing is any number of atoms that could potentially be bound at this portion. All amino acids that make up proteins all have this same structure. What differs among them is what is found at this R group. So some might just have a hydrogen. Some might have a carbon bound to a couple of oxygens. Each amino acid is different in just that region, the R group. So let's look at alanine for an example. Let's get our bearings. Up at the top, there is the COOH group, the acid group. On the left side, there is the H2N group, the amine group. And then off the central carbon atom, there's the hydrogen group. And down below it, in the R group, there is a carbon bound to 3 more hydrogens. Alanine has this structure all the time. Every amino acid that you come across that has this structure with the C with the 3 hydrogens in the R group area would be an alanine. And so what we often see represented in textbooks and so on are amino acids just as different colors as is shown here. The different amino acids can be built into what we call a peptide. So the amino acids are actually bound together, let's say two of them here, and there's a peptide bond that holds them together. We form a polypeptide, so many peptides, when many amino acids react to form different peptide bonds, and ultimately in the end we form protein. We'll look at exactly the steps in terms of how proteins are formed later on in the course, but a polypeptide is made up of many amino acids, just like we saw earlier, a polysaccharide is made up of many monosaccharides. So before we move on to the two other types of organic molecules, let's look at enzymes and describe how they work. The reason that I'm inserting it into this portion of the course is because ultimately enzymes are a type of protein. Proteins, though, that cause catabolism or anabolism and help speed up the reaction for those types of reactions. And so how does an enzyme ultimately work? Well, let's look at an example of one. Here's an enzyme. It doesn't matter which one, but what we can actually see is a protein made up of many amino acids, but we actually have a region at the top that is the active site of the enzyme. Here we have a chemical, let's say one that we actually want to break down to undergo a catabolic reaction. Well, those reactions might take place in the body over time if we left the chemical long enough, but an enzyme helps to speed up that reaction. The chemical will actually move into the active site of the enzyme. And in doing so, what will happen is the reaction between that chemical and the active site, or the chemicals, the amino acids around the active site, will actually change the shape of the protein, allowing it to actually cause the reaction. And so in this case, it will actually move to split apart that chemical on some level. This is a basic overview of how enzymes work without looking at any specific chemicals, but enzymes will come up throughout the course, and we need to realize that an enzyme is made up of protein, and it helps to speed up a reaction by causing a reaction in the active site. One thing I will mention is the opposite of what we just saw is also true. Let's say these are two chemicals that we actually want to bind together within our body to form one new chemical. Those two chemicals might move into the active site of another enzyme, and the opposite situation would be the case where the two come together, the enzyme changes shape in such a way that actually forms the two chemicals into one chemical. Moving on to the two other types of organic compounds, we first come to nucleic acids. So here we're looking at DNA, though there's also RNA, which again we'll look at later on in the course. But DNA, the building block of it, are nucleotides. And so, as you can see in the picture on the right, there are actually nucleotides that look like the nucleotide on the left, repeating over and over all along the DNA. The nucleotide itself is made up of three subunits. The first is a phosphate group, which is a phosphorus bound to 4 oxygens. The second region in the middle is a sugar, and the final region is a base. There are 4 different types of nucleotides in DNA, and there's also 4 different types actually in RNA, though they're slightly different from the DNA nucleotides. But looking at DNA first, we can see that there are thymine, adenine, guanine, and cytosine. These are actually the building blocks of DNA, which when we look at DNA in our bodies, which we'll do in the next unit of this week, DNA is actually made up of millions of these nucleotides. One thing you might notice from the image on the right is that cytosine always pairs up, matches up with guanine that is on the other side of the double-stranded helix that we see in the image here. Adenine always matches with thymine. The last organic compound that we will look at are lipids. And so I've thrown one example here of butter, but there are actually various types of lipids that we will come across in this course. So the first is a triglyceride, a glycerol molecule, which we don't actually have to worry about all of the structure of it, but bound to 3 fatty acids. So here we have the 3 fatty acids that have all come together and bound to the glycerol. Another form of fat, beyond the triglyceride, is a phospholipid, which will come up in the next unit when we look at cells. But in this case we have a glycerol, but it's bound to 2 fatty acids, but then the 3rd fatty acid is replaced by a phosphorus-containing group. And so it has a phosphorus in that group bound to 3 oxygens. A third category of lipids are steroids, which have this basic structure. There are 4 carbon rings bound to each other, and then we have a chain bound to one of the carbon rings there, which has different structures to represent the different kinds of steroids that exist. For example, cholesterol is one steroid. Later on in the course, when we start talking about hormones, testosterone and estrogen and other hormones actually have a steroid structure. And so now we're done Unit 2, and as I mentioned in Unit 1, good strategies in order to understand this material better are to go through the videos again, go to the appropriate chapter of your textbook, and use your study guide in order to answer questions based on this material to try to assess your understanding of the content so far.